About here, we've been told to read the Bible as literally as possible, as historically as possible, which is fine. Most Christians are trying to protect certain doctrines when they do that, but also when you do that, you miss the symbolic connection, like what I was just talking about between Adam and Eve and Noah. Most Protestants who have read those stories a dozen times, whoosh, just flies over their head. They don't pick up any of it. You can put this on recording if you want, by the way. I'm off topic, but this will be the most interesting lesson in the series.
So is he saying that because of his behavior was kind of prefiguring it's contrary to what God did, you said in Adam and Eve?
Yeah.
And that kind of prefigures the hostility of the Canaanites toward God, God's ways, and that sort of thing.
I think there's something of that there, that the Canaanites are positively hostile to the people of Israel, and they come to represent all that is godless and bad. And it's interesting that even the Romans felt that way. The Romans were not themselves the godliest people, but even they felt that Canaanite culture was uniquely dark. Senator Cato's famous statement, "Carthage must fall," that the Canaanites, they butchered their own children. They were a trading colony on the Mediterranean, so they were very focused on money and sex and pleasure, and they were very, very violent in a very, very dark culture. And even other civilizations felt that way about them. It wasn't just that the Israelites did, they just felt that it was a really dark culture. And we see civilizations like that throughout history. Some of them are not all of them are Christian, but some of them are more bright and good and healthy, and some of them are more dark and sick and unhealthy. So, we were talking a moment ago about whether you protect the reputation or whether in our own time Americans love to tear down their heroes, to find out their dirty little secrets. And that's a very, I'm not on board with the present desire to find out everything that's wrong with our founding fathers or the heroes of the past. But having said that, you do, when you look back in history, realize that the cover-up can go too far, and it does enable people to continue to perpetuate certain kinds of things that should not be perpetuated. You mentioned Kennedy, and he doesn't look so noble these days. You know, if you do the biographical stuff on him. And then you have other heroes that stand up remarkably well. For all of the scurrying around, Abraham Lincoln still seems to tower above, but I don't know. Have you read any bios on Lincoln?
Oh, yes, but just the other day we heard on the news with Gabriel.
Oh, they're saying that? Oh. That's a hard sell. Yeah, that one's going to be a hard sell.
I read one book on the Civil War, a fairly recent one. I can't remember the name of the author, but he said that after studying, he spent so much of his life studying the Civil War, and he says even after studying the Civil War and seeing Lincoln's flaws and foibles, he said he still, in his mind, as far as the people in his generation, he said he just towers over everybody else in his generation.
I've read several bios on Lincoln, and as a moral and religious man, he wrestled with Christianity. He wrestled with it his whole life. He's a remarkable person. Just really, really remarkable. So we tie that off kind of with a bow, and I'm going to pick up today in God Speaks, the Voice of Longing on page 34. But we had kind of an intro to the class, and the way I've laid it out is with these two words, creation and covenant. The idea here is that God speaks all the time in multiple ways, and that we as Christians often, this is a cliche, but put him, so to speak, in a box. The created things are things that all people have access to. We have that psalm. There's no language or tongue where his voice is not heard. God is the creator. Everyone hears his voice. I believe that. But the covenant is something that happens in history. And to that extent, there are ways in which God speaks that are privileged to people who either were there or have heard about it. So, for example, Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt, the only way you're going to know about that is if you were there, or if you're reading your Bible and somebody who was there is telling you about it. So that is what by the covenant, I'll just add the word here, I'm talking about the historical. There is a historical feature to the Jewish and the Christian faith, that God enters into history, in that he engages with man, and that opens up a whole new vista of revelation. And so much so that that's sometimes what we mean by the word revelation, is that. Now, that's tricky because God is relevant to all people in all places and at all times. But when he reveals himself historically, the people who are the participants in that are in a certain sense privileged. And that can create offense. That can definitely create offense. Even today, people take a great deal of offense at the Jewish nation, that they think that they're special, that they think that they're different, that they think that they're privileged. And that stigma carries over into Christianity very, very quickly. If you're on, Christians too catch heat from the idea that they feel that they are a chosen and special people. And that's just natural human psychology. Go back to first or second grade. If there's a kid in class who thinks he's somehow privileged or special or different than the others, that individual will be hated by a large number of people. Who do you think you are anyways? So that's where we get to the covenant. We talked about his presence versus his absence, but in these last series of lessons, 3, and I'm going to finish them today, we're dealing with what are called the transcendentals. And you hear them as the words truth, goodness, and beauty. Since the days of Plato, these 3 words have signified man's highest striving. Are my beliefs true? Is my life good? Is my experience of the beautiful? And we encounter all different. Most people I encounter are bent those ways themselves. There are intellectual people who are very focused on questions of truth. There are very moral people who are focused on activity, doing good things. And then probably the smallest category are the artistic types. Good luck to them, to try to find a way of monetizing their gifts in this world. But they're sensitive people. They are definitely sensitive to beauty. And so, talked a little bit about the voice of reason, conscience, and longing. Now, last week, I focused on natural longing, and we talked about the sublime. That which is beautiful draws us, and we can arrange them in a scale from the lower things to the higher things. We're drawn to food. We're drawn to sex. Those are natural things that we inherit from the animal kingdom. But at the human level, there are even deeper longings than those. And so as we work our way up, once we get to the top, we arrive at the experience of, there's not a good word for it, sublimity. But there are things in the natural order that evoke profound longing in the human soul. I talked a lot about C.S. Lewis last week because of modern 20th century writers. I don't find very many that write about this. He writes about it as a very powerful experience in his own life. But today, on page 34, I'm going to talk about supernatural longing. I'm not sure if this is the best phrase for what it is we're going to talk about here, but I'll put it up there. And this is evoked by the covenant. There is a longing in the human heart that is awakened. And so we might say it sleeps. But is awakened in the hearing of the gospel. Paul talks a little bit about this in his own preaching activity, that when he delivers the gospel, it's a historical story about God entering into history to save humankind. How will they believe if they have not heard? And how will they hear unless someone is sent to preach? And many of you have had experiences of altar calls or other areas where a preacher delivered the gospel message and it stirred something that had been asleep. And when you hear that message, the word woke means something different these days, but there's an awakening. There is a vision of a higher life that you didn't even know was open to you. And now is open to you in a way that it never was before. And it stirs passion and desire and longing. And there's a lot we could say about it, but I've got the voice of supernatural longing, the sleeping, and then the awakening that happens. I experienced it many times, usually going to youth camp, usually hearing altar calls by preachers, and if that's what saved me, I always joke I must have been saved well over a dozen times. Because I would always find myself up front. On page 35, at the top, I say natural religion is inherently perfect. It can inspire us to seek the face of God or the deity, but it cannot render us fit for an encounter with him, or furnish us with the one condition necessary for such an encounter to occur, which is God himself. That's very important, that in the gospel and in the faith of Israel, God takes the initiative to reach out to us. We can seek for God, but the gospel is a way of saying God has sought us. And that's important. We can think of imperfect human analogies, but just in the dating market, there's a difference between hunting around for a partner and having somebody come to you. They take the initiative, right? That changes everything. Especially when everybody's sitting around waiting for somebody else to make a move. It's a breath of fresh air. This is on a religious level. This is not about the dating market. In the Bible, this act of divine visitation occurs first in the temple and then in Jesus Christ. In either case, however, the man of faith does not long for a God who is absent, but for a deeper knowledge of the one who has made himself present. This passage from Ephesians 1:17. I keep asking, Paul says, that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the glorious Father, may give you the spirit of wisdom and revelation so that you may know him better. Religious longing of this kind takes the form of a desire to deepen one's awareness of God having made himself present. Realize and experience what we acknowledge in faith, that we have been washed and filled with the presence of the Holy Spirit. All believers have some experience of God, and although his presence may at times feel very slight, it is at least minimally attested by our desire for its increase. If we claim to have faith, but can find in ourselves no longing for godliness, we are deceiving ourselves. So, this is awakened in the hearing of the gospel that God has acted on our behalf. God has acted on our behalf. I run churches more than I do evangelistic kinds of settings in revivals. But I have preached some good, I think they were good, evangelistic sermons. Billy Graham was very good at these. He was just a master of taking a large number of people who were not particularly religious and helping them to see what was being offered to them, that God was reaching out to them, and they had only to respond, and he would enter into their life. That is an awakening. That's a new way of thinking. So I'll stop a moment, see if there's any questions, but last week when I was talking about natural longing, I'm just talking about all humans in every country, in every part of the world, Christian or non-Christian, have this longing for God. But here, when we hear that God has reached out to us, that changes everything. And it gives rise to new passion. Here's an imperfect analogy, and then I'll see if there's any question or comment. But if you were let's say you're back in middle school, back when kids have their crushes and everything. Anybody ever have a crush? If you haven't had a crush, you've never lived. Because a crush is one of the most wonderful things on earth. She's frowning. She's like, I don't know about that. But there's no more blissful form of delusion. Let's put it that way. No more blissful form of delusion that, and you're longing for this person, and you're dreaming about them, you're thinking about them constantly. And then one day, they send you a letter. Can you imagine the amount of joy that comes tumbling out that the person you've been dreaming about, they've been thinking about you? Anybody ever had that experience? Or you've never had a satisfied crush? Which is good, because then usually follows the disappointment that you realize that they weren't everything that you fantasized that they were. But in some ways, the gospel is like that. There is this longing for God, and now there is the story. He is actually pursuing us. We're not just pursuing him. He is actually in pursuit of mankind. Good translation of the 23rd Psalm, we always render the psalm, "Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the day of my life." But I've often challenged that. The Hebrew word there means pursue. Goodness and mercy actively pursue me. They hunt me down. They chase me down. And that has a little bit more strength to it than the version that we're used to hearing. So, okay. I'll wait a few minutes, because we will get through this lesson today. We better, because I got to move on to new things next week. Let me see if there's any question or comment. My daughter walked in here. Did everybody see Rachel? She smiled and waved. I didn't expect to see her. She's in town. So in case you didn't know, she came wisping through here. And some of you know, others of you don't, that we dropped Nate off to Michigan Tech in the furthermost regions of the state of Michigan this week. Way, way up in the Upper Peninsula. I had never been over Mackinac Bridge. I had never been up in the UP. I had heard about it. I had talked to people who had done it. I had never myself done it. And I did not realize how beautiful our state is. It is so incredible up there. And I'm thinking, what am I doing down here by Detroit with my books? I should be up there. That's where, it's wonderful up there. So we got some head nods there, but I'd never been over the bridge. Wonderful. I'd planned to do it. I planned to do it, and it didn't happen, or we were going to do it, and it didn't happen, and one thing came up or another. For some reason, it just never happened. And when we took Nate up to drop him off this week, I was driving. It was a long drive, and I thought, this is incredible. This is really, really wonderful.
There used to be a ferry before there was a bridge.
Okay.
I remember doing that.
Well, it's a very big bridge. I've crossed other bridges over rivers, but that bridge is a little bit bigger. Yeah, and the water's dark blue. Dark blue. Okay, on page 34, it says the marks of genuine affection for God. So here, this is where we get all judgy. Do you love God? Paul has a passage where he says, if anyone does not love the Lord, a curse be on him. We ought to love God. And we don't always love God. It's an acquired taste. And so what I will say, and you can tuck this away and think about it, you can agree with it or disagree with it, that the highest things in life are not given. We have to acquire them. And if God is love, and if God is everything that we think that he is, then we're going to have to work a little bit to acquire a taste for that. It can't be the case that the finest music, the finest art, the finest literature all take work, but God doesn't. We might have a seed of love for God, even as small children. And the seed is there, but it's sort of like being, when you're trying to keep a flame alive in a strong wind, you have to protect it and grow it. There is something that we must do. At various points in church history, individuals have adopted different attitudes toward the life of religious feeling, emotion. A lot of times, even in Christian circles, we attack and despise the life of feeling and emotion. And I think that that's a mistake. Feelings are important. And it's not that you want to be carried away by your emotions into all kinds of obscure beliefs. I understand that there's a danger there. But we are feeling creatures, and emotion is an organ of knowledge. Emotion is an organ of knowledge, and there are some things that you cannot know in any other way than unless you feel them. And so I have met people who said to me things like, well, you don't go by your feelings, do you, Mr. Lewis? In this sort of, cold way. And I think, well, I do, actually. Often go by my feelings. I don't go solely by my emotions, but do my feelings and emotions inform my beliefs about the world? Absolutely they do. Absolutely. So I'm a little counter-enlightenment thrust here. It's not all about cerebral things. At present, there are many religious circles where all high expressions of feelings are looked on as signs of supernatural grace. Certainly, my parents grew up within Pentecostal circles where emotion was rampant. Individuals who exhibit them are assumed to be filled with the Spirit. In other religious circles, though, and this was what I was talking about a moment ago, it's become fashionable to deprecate the life of religious feeling. Both of these are extremes. Second paragraph from the bottom here. We run from one to the next, now praising all emotions without qualification. I use the word here, affections, religious affections. Now condemning all affections without qualification. But a godly approach is not to do away with our emotions, but to acquire the wisdom to distinguish between those that are true and those that are false. There are such things as true and false emotions. We can have an emotion that is inappropriate, but we can also fail to have one that is appropriate. There are certain objects that ought to evoke our awe and wonder and feeling, and if we're not having those emotions, it's not like we need to feel guilty about that, but there's something defective going on. If we're in the presence of something wondrous and we have no wonder, there's something wrong. If we're in the presence of something beautiful and we have no desire, then there's something wrong. And that needs to be addressed. Certain things ought to evoke that feeling. If somebody, this is just a personal thing, and I could never prove this, but if somebody listens to the first movement of Beethoven's Third Symphony and they're not moved by it, I'm not going to say there's something wrong with Beethoven's Third Symphony. I'm going to say you are, well, I won't try to be insulting about it, but I'll say we're going to teach you to appreciate this symphony because it's a beautiful piece of music.
Our current culture seems to want to change things that are naturally beautiful. They're trying to make us see things differently.
Right.
And it's kind of crazy because they're universal.
There's certain universal things, and they can, but you're right, they're trying to train us either to feel, or even if we don't feel, at least to say in public. I think that's probably what it is. You know, if I'm over at Target and there's a photo where there used to be a photo of a model of a wonderful looking person, and they put a different photo up there, it's almost challenging. It's like seeing one of those pieces of modern art in the museum. It's almost challenging you to say, do you have the chutzpah to challenge whether this belongs here? I've seen art in a museum and I've thought, this does not belong in a museum. It's not worthy to be here. It's not beautiful. It's not good. It's not true. There's nothing going on here. And I'm not against all modern art. Some modern art pieces that are a little bit more abstract, I think there's real things going on there, but that opens the door for people to try to bungle you and to try to get you to set aside your judgment. So you're right about that. You can be deceived by following feelings that are false. We've all heard that. However, you can also be deceived by not following feelings that are true. If we have deep passions and desires that are legitimate, we need to follow those. And if we fail to follow those, then we are missing out on something. So I am not one of those, even though I'm heavily weighted in the cerebral area. Actually, I got to tell this story because my wife last week was reading this lesson entitled The Voice of Longing, and it's talking about beauty. She was sitting right there and she's reading this. She's going like this. And she looks at me and she says, "I'm not feeling it." And I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "You've analyzed it and broken it down, and you've taken a beautiful flower and you've cut it up into pieces and pressed it in your book like a scientist." And I had to say, you're right. That's exactly what I've done. So I'm weighted in the cerebral area, but the fact is she made a really good point, which is that there's more to life than that, even in the religious life. Even in the religious life. So, last paragraph on page 35. If anyone thinks that his life is rich in religious affection or feeling or emotion, let him bear in mind the distinction between the real and the apparent. Many things praised by men are not necessarily praiseworthy. The proof. How do we know whether our feelings are legitimate or not? How do we judge rightly when it comes to emotion? It doesn't have to do with the intensity, variety, or certitude with which they are felt, nor in the fact that we sense them as coming from outside of ourselves, or in connection even with a passage of Scripture, or even attended by what appear to be miraculous signs, or even by a feeling of peace, affection toward our brother, or praise toward God. Top of page 36, and certainly not in that it disposes us to talk much about religion or do much in matters pertaining to religion or persuade others of our religious piety. All of these things may accompany our religious feelings, but they are not a proof. The only test for the authenticity of our religious feelings be found in their conformity with the Scriptures, more specifically what we read about concerning therein the presence of the Father, the Spirit of Christ, or the Holy Spirit. What is that saying? We test our affections. On the one hand, are they in conformity with the joint testimony of the people of Israel and the church? That's one side of it, but are they making us into better people? Are they making us into better people? Do they call us to higher and deeper things? That will be the test of the authenticity of our affections. Now, I do not take credit for writing that. I stole that from Jonathan Edwards. You've probably heard of Jonathan Edwards. He wrote a little book that I've read many times called Religious Affections. You've probably heard of the First Great Awakening in American history, where throughout America there were these preachers having these big revivals, and a lot of people were having powerful religious experiences. Jonathan Edwards wrote a book dozens of years later about that, because many people who had claimed to have these powerful religious experiences, nothing came of it, or they even turned away from the faith. And so in this book, Jonathan Edwards is thinking about religion and emotion, and he's trying to ask himself, obviously religious emotion is powerful for us, but he's trying to ask himself, how do we determine when the affections that we have are real? How do we judge that? So it's a nice little book, not a bestseller, several hundred years old, but if you want to read Jonathan Edwards' Religious Affections, he's even more analytical than I am. So it's a very, very good book. What do the Scriptures, though, teach us about the Holy Spirit? So if we're in conformity with the Scriptures, and if these religious feelings and emotions and desires are making us a better person, what do we learn? It is a supernatural being, the presence of whom is attested in the act of faith, only secondarily in his affects or effects. What does that mean? It means that I take hold of God by faith. If I'm having a bad day, I don't think that God's far from me. If I'm having a good day, I don't think that He's close from me. I take hold of Him by faith. And that's very, very important to steady our lives. Otherwise, we'll be tossed about by our emotions every day, every hour, every moment. But His presence is always accompanied by a longing for holiness and the fruit of good works. So what is the emotion, what is the feeling, what is the affection that accompanies genuine faith? It's always longing for greater holiness, greater devotion, greater commitment to God. Love, awe, and humility are the bedrock of all other religious affections. And I'll probably land on that. My awe of God is connected with my humility toward myself. The bigger the God, the smaller I am. So when I am feeling humbled, it's because I feel God's exaltedness. And when I sense His sacrificial work on my behalf, then I want to do that for other people. I want to sacrifice things of my own life to show love to others. Those are real religious affections, feelings, passions. Famous verse from Deuteronomy chapter 10, Israel, what does God ask of you? But to fear Him, to walk in His ways, love Him, serve Him with all your heart, with all your soul, and observe His commands and decrees that I'm giving you this day for your own good. So, just a bit there about religious affection. Now, the final section, and I don't know how much time we'll have for that, is on how to cultivate that. Well, I talked a little bit about having a flame that you kind of try to protect from the wind. How do we... I think most Christians do experience these things. They have times where they feel a desire to be more holy. a desire to be more loving. But it's very easy for the circumstances of life to roll over that. And so how do we encourage that? But let me stop a moment and see if there's any question or comment while I'm talking about these things. Reason and conscience are important. The voice of longing, though, I think is pretty important in the religious life, and I don't think we talk about it too much. I don't hear too many Christians spend too much time talking about feelings. Feelings are important, are really, really important. Yeah.
The Deuteronomy passage is really a good example. When you hear God's word, it inspires you to love God. It gives you knowledge that His will for you is the best.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it's important that we hear, we listen.
We hear about His love for us. Well, there's that passage in the New Testament. We love Him because He first loved us. God's not asking us to generate this of ourselves. But when we hear it, it inspires that reciprocal love. And we all need that because we're finite creatures. We're limited. Our capacity to love and sacrifice for our fellow creatures is, I'd say, considerably limited. I don't find myself just overflowing with love and self-sacrifice. I often find myself small, petty, angry, irritable, impatient, not very focused. And so, I can't pull myself out of that through my own efforts. So what you said, hearing about God's love for me, this final section on 36 and 37, and this might be actually a takeaway in terms of, well, what can we do since we're such miserable creatures? When I was doing the liturgy, we have this phrase in the Book of Common Prayer, and we use it when we do the confession here at New Temple. Have mercy on us, miserable offenders. And many churches have gotten rid of that phrase, and I kept it, because I feel like it just is the heart of the matter. We're just miserable. We're selfish, we're petty, we're narrow. Have mercy on us. How are we going to get ourselves out of this pickle? Last paragraph on page 36, I say a number of things in the analytical way that I so often say them. To cultivate this kind of love for God is a great challenge. We are impatient, we are restless. We want the quickest possible solution, and that usually means outward diversion rather than attentiveness on God. When we look at the way we live our lives, we find that a lot of it's not really done freely, but under duress, under pressure. Especially in our relationships with others, we develop superficial acquaintanceships, tiresome friendships, suffocating romances. Is it a hug or a headlock? I'm not quite sure all the time, Although this inner impetuosity seems harmless enough, it often lies at the root of our most deeply entrenched habits, weaving godlessness into the fabric of our daily lives. Only by mastering our inner, probably the key word here is emptiness, can we succeed in the art of being in the world without being of the world. Attentiveness to God is difficult, but we can get better at it with practice. And usually it begins in the early morning and then late at night when we're lying on our beds, to be attentive. And Becky has reminded me of this on numerous occasions in view of my own failings. Probably one of, if not the most fundamental way to show someone that you love them is to give them your attention. I remember that when I'm doing my hospice chaplaincy. Many people do not receive attention. And we give our attention to the things that we love. And that's really tricky because a lot of times we say that we love, we profess our love. Well, you're all adults here. You'll have a hard time convincing someone that you love them if you don't pay attention, right? Very, very tricky. And so that can be shocking because when we look at the things that we pay attention to, we may have a moment of reckoning where we say, oh my goodness, I don't love the things that I say that I do. What do I love? Well, what do I give my attention to? Very, very tough. So we attend to God because we want to cultivate the love for God. So we have to think about Him. We have to read the Bible or pray or give our mind to the cross. Not in the abundance of what we say. There's the line from Shakespeare, "Methinks the lady protesteth too much," which is Shakespeare's way of saying we're very chatty about something when we're secretly in anxiety about whether that's really how we are, you know. There's a few other things here I could talk about, but I need to bring this lesson to a close. I think it's a good lesson. And then next week we'll be on to something else. We're almost at the end of August, hard to believe. We'll be in this lesson, but I'll have the voice of, it might actually be the Bible. So those of you who are wondering, will he ever talk about the Bible? Yes, the Bible is part of this. But I will print that up and bring it up next week. Okay, let me close with a word of prayer.